This is History 362, Lecture 12 on the Harlem Renaissance, and I will also be talking about the First War on Drugs. The Harlem Renaissance is the cultural manifestation of the New Negro movement of the 19-teens and 1920s, a time in which artists and musicians and literary figures started to take a lot of pride in their African American heritage. Harlem, as I mentioned in Lecture 11, emerged as a black metropolis as a result of the Great Migration. Before 1900, it had been an upper middle class neighborhood of fine homes and apartment houses, and it was mainly a Jewish and German immigrant neighborhood. In the 1890s, feeling like the housing market was going to be constantly on an upward trend, real estate developers overbuilt, and this caused the price of the housing to drop, and black realtors took advantage of the situation to promote the area to African American clients. So overbuilding of really nice brownstone houses gave them the opportunity to really move into the neighborhood in great numbers. In 1920, Harlem stretched from 130th Street in Manhattan to 145th Street and was home to about 73,000 African Americans. By 1930, it had migrated north and south to include the area from 125th to 155th Street and contained about 164,000 African American residents. Harlem in the 1920s began to stand for a cultural renaissance that was taking place among black intellectuals. James Weldon Johnson, who started off his adult life as a lawyer, started to make money by writing songs, musicals, and vaudeville acts for a black audience. Among his works is the song Lift Every Voice and Sing, which for a long time was considered to be a sort of black national anthem. He also wrote an autobiography of an ex-colored man. This was a novel, and it considered the life of an African-American man who was light-skinned enough to pass for white. While the protagonist is able to pass, which eliminates his social and political problems, he's left with a larger psychological problem. Another important figure in the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes, came to Harlem at the age of 21 to enroll in Columbia University. He was already a celebrated poet, and although he dropped out shortly after he enrolled in order to become a busboy, he continued to make a name for himself as a poet who identified with the black lower classes, who practiced a kind of realism and who celebrated music as the true expression of black culture. I will play just briefly a bit of the Lift Every Voice and Sing song that, as I said, was considered kind of the black national anthem, and you can look up other versions of this on YouTube. So that has several verses, and you can watch, as I said, various different versions of that on YouTube. Part of what made the Harlem Renaissance significant was the promotion of Black artists. And Alain Locke, a Rhodes Scholar who earned a PhD from Harvard and who taught literature and philosophy at Howard University, was one of the foremost promoters of African American talent. He edited a special edition of the 1925 Survey Graphic magazine in which he celebrated Black literature and art. And then he went on to kind of expand this into an anthology called The New Negro in 1926. It included writings from Langston Hughes and from Johnson and from Zora Neale Hurston and Gwendolyn Bennett and others, and also included the art of Aaron Douglas, who was considered the foremost plastic artist of the Harlem Renaissance. It included essays about Negro spirituals, dance, and folk literature, and it really had a distinctive style and a distinctive voice. Harlem Renaissance artists sought to capture the authentic uniqueness of the African American experience. They affirmed Black identity, they valued their African heritage, but unlike Marcus Garvey's followers, they were also integrationists in that they relied on white patronage for the production of their works. The intellectual patrons of the Harlem Renaissance differed in what the definition of authenticity ought to be in Negro art. W.E.B. Du Bois published an article called Criteria of Negro Art in The Crisis in 1926. And he said, a Black artist's role should be to produce work that would sophisticate the image of African Americans, that they had a moral and ethical responsibility to present themselves and their culture in the best possible light, and in doing so to combat the kinds of degrading stereotypes that had been in circulation within American popular culture and which had been conveyed through such forms as blackface minstrelsy and plantation fiction. He wrote, quote, all art is propaganda. In contrast, Langston Hughes wrote The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, which was published in The Nation in 1926, and he said the only responsibility that Black artists had was to produce art that spoke to the Black experience in the U.S. He wrote, perhaps these common people will give to the world its truly great Negro artist, the one who is not afraid to be himself. The celebration of the common people underpinned Hughes' engagement with common everyday culture and with forms like blues and jazz. And he said, people should be able to express their individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. Okay, so even though a lot of the patrons of the Harlem Renaissance were white, the sort of founding fathers of the Harlem Renaissance were really divided over what constituted authenticity for Black artists. There's another Aaron Douglas painting on the top there, which I think is incredibly beautiful. And on the bottom, these are a couple of photos by James Vanderzee, who I'll be talking about on the next slide. A lot of the depictions of Harlem in the 1920s were made by the photographer James Vanderzee. He had a photographic studio on Lenox Avenue in Harlem, and he was the documentarian of everyday life there. He shot portraits of fraternal organizations, of church groups, of Harlem celebrities. He kept all kinds of clothing, really nice clothing in his studio so that people could dress up into their aspirational selves. He was very influenced by the glamour shots of the emerging movie industry, and he really made people look their best when he photographed them. But he also did a lot of group projects on location. Many of these were focused on various social organizations, bridge clubs, literary salons, Masonic meeting places, sports teams. And it's important to note that this gives us a view of something very real about Harlem, the fact that these organizations were the glue that bound this community together and played a crucial role in helping African Americans in Harlem to understand themselves, to know who they were. People who lived in Harlem in the 1920s loved it because it was a city within a city. It was a city of African Americans, which was this enclave within a much larger city. Young new Negro artists asserted their independence and founded their own literary publication called Fire in 1926. It chafed at artistic visions that aimed to attract white audiences and serve a political purpose. Its contributors wanted to focus on the lower classes and the gritty details of Black life, and to, in the words of Langston Hughes, quote, pour racial individuality into the mold of American standardization. Unfortunately, the group only held together long enough to publish a single issue of the magazine, but you can see the front cover of that magazine depicted over at the right of the slide. All Black theatrical productions created by Black artists were featured on Broadway during the Harlem Renaissance. For example, Shuffle Along, which had been written by the Chicago-based comedy team of Flournoy Miller and Aubrey Lyles, and the musical team of Noble Sissel and U.B. Blake, who composed the show's tune, and it was very popular. And so here you can see it was, this was part of the cast of Shuffle Along, and obviously it had song and dance numbers, because it looks like these women are about to dance. Now, in addition to the plastic arts and the literary arts, African American music came into its own really between 1900 and 1930. We talked about the blues, and that was part of the Black musical scene, but you also had the development in this time period of jazz, and that becomes one of the most famous, most authentic expressions of American culture, something that makes the United States famous across the world, really, and it all starts with African American musicians. White Americans were patrons very often of jazz music, and their patronage of Black culture, or what they thought was Black culture, goes all the way back to the 1830s and the age of the minstrel show. I told you about Jump Jim Crow, that famous song. Even after the Civil War, African American entertainers who were blocked from learning and playing classical instruments continued to perform in minstrel shows and to sing songs about the plantation. They also performed a kind of satirical dance that parodied white manners before the Civil War, called the cakewalk. Doing the cakewalk dance became a point of pride, and there were national competitions. At first, minstrel show songs accompanied the cakewalk, but by the late 1890s, new compositions called ragtime pieces were composed to accompany them. The first ragtime piece composed by a Black composer, Tom Turpin, was called the Harlem Rag. The ragtime genre was really perfected by Scott Joplin from Sedalia, Missouri, who published the Maple Leaf Rag in 1899. And even though Joplin only earned a penny on each copy of the music that was sold, the popularity of the piece immediately earned him a living wage. He then moved his family to St. Louis, where he composed other well-known ragtime classics, including The Entertainer. That the 1920s is known as, quote, the jazz age, unquote, is mostly due to piano players. The syncopated rhythms of ragtime were adopted by New Orleans stride piano players, like Jelly Roll Morton, for example, who mixed in notated and improvised music. And of course, jazz is all about improvisation. So other kinds of jazz, other musical instruments, jazz came out of the piano. Jazz piano was also developing in the 1920s in New York City with players like Eubie Blake and Willie the Lion Smith. I'm going to show you a little bit of stride piano in a moment. But before I do that, I want to also say that jazz music was associated in many people's minds with drinking and smoking and fast living and people going on petting parties in cars and women in short skirts and dances like the turkey trot that were the farthest thing from polite culture. So jazz in the 1920s was really very transgressive. It was something that shocked parents and shocked clergy people, but it was extremely popular. All right, so let's hear Carolina shout. Okay, so during the Harlem Renaissance, white Americans discovered blues singers and jazz musicians, and they flocked to Harlem nightclubs where they could drink openly during the Prohibition years in America, which was from 1918 to 1933. Alcohol sales were prohibited, but you could get a hold of alcohol in speakeasies and clubs in Harlem. White audiences could hear Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey sing blues ballads. They could hear Duke Ellington's and Louis Armstrong's jazz compositions. The Cotton Club in Harlem featured Duke Ellington and a host of black blues singers, jazz composers, and dancers. But it's interesting to note that the Cotton Club was really only open to white patrons. White patrons found Harlem's cultural offerings risky and exotic and exciting, but that didn't mean they actually wanted to rub elbows with the people who lived in Harlem. So again, you have the authenticity question of, to what extent was the Harlem Renaissance kind of pandering in an inappropriate way to the white community rather than being fully authentic. Harlem did have other forms of entertainment that really catered more to the black community. One very common one was the rent party. Rent parties were these parties that people would throw in order to be able to make rent. They would have music, they would invite people to dance, they'd have food, and you can see an advertisement there on the bottom right-hand corner of the slide and a picture from inside a rent party at the top. Harlem was also home to drag balls starting in the 1920s. Female impersonators, both black and white, would perform, and this attracted members of the gay community from all over the city. Historical research has shown that probably due to the pervasiveness of its nightlife, Harlem also had a lot of prostitution arrests. So it was really, really a center for people to come and enjoy nightlife of various kinds. Harlem Renaissance is a little bit of a misnomer because there were people outside Harlem who were writing in the same kind of thematic vein. Lawrence, Kansas was home to Langston Hughes before he came to New York City in the 1920s. The title poem of his first book of poetry, The Weary Blues, was inspired in large part by a street corner musician he encountered during his childhood in Kansas. And his first and most important novel, Not Without Laughter, was set in a fictionalized version of his hometown, and it addressed the issue of migration to the urban north and the way in which the arts provided an escape from poverty for talented African Americans. Aaron Douglas was also from Kansas. He was from Topeka, and he became friends with Langston Hughes in Harlem. Douglas studied art at the University of Nebraska and taught art in Kansas City before moving to Harlem in 1924. Other African Americans born elsewhere established their career in the West. Many black musicians performed in Western cities, but at least 3 had deeper ties there. Jelly Roll Morton, one of the founding fathers of American jazz, spent the 6 years from 1917 to 1923 based in Los Angeles. Louis Armstrong also performed and became the orchestra leader at the Cotton Club in Los Angeles. Between 1932, when he made his film debut, through 1945, he participated as an actor or musician in 16 Hollywood films. Black filmmaker Oscar Micheaux left native Illinois to become a homesteader in South Dakota in 1905, and he didn't last very long as a homesteader in South Dakota, but it gave him the idea for 2 novels and 1 motion picture. The experiences of individual writers and artists clearly indicate that the Harlem Renaissance extended into the West. For example, Texas, cities like Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, San Antonio had a lot of cultural energy. And even in El Paso, the poet Bernice Love Wiggins published a volume of poetry that belongs to the Harlem Renaissance, Tuneful Tales. It was published in 1925. Folklorist J. Mason Brewer published a volume of Black Texas poetry, Heralding Dawn, while teaching at Houston Tillotson College in Austin, Texas. The Renaissance also came to other Great Plains states. Black communities in Oklahoma City and Tulsa had black artists. Ralph Ellison grew up playing in a jazz band there in Oklahoma. Omaha and Lincoln, Nebraska were centers of artistic, musical, and literary contributions. This is a picture of Bernice Love Wiggins at the right. Jean Toomer, who was a poet, spent considerable time in Taos, New Mexico. And Anita Scott Coleman from Silver City, eventually, she was a very prolific writer. She published over 30 short stories in leading periodicals of the day. She also published poetry. And I have included a really wonderful poem by Anita Scott Coleman on the right of the screen. So if you want to pause the lecture for a moment and read the poem, you can. I just think it's a great poem. There were also newspapers catering to African American communities in Tucson and Phoenix and Albuquerque, and San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco/Oakland loomed large with lots of Black authors and entertainers. Okay, so the Harlem Renaissance, more than just Harlem. Why did the Harlem Renaissance end finally? Well, when the stock market crashed in 1929, the white audiences who had been patronizing Black literature and art and music didn't have the money anymore to do that. And the Harlem Renaissance writers and poets, and to a lesser extent the musicians, were too distant from the working class Black communities that they sought to energize, drew too much inspiration from European style to sustain viability during the economic depression. So it's really this just bright shining moment that is pretty much limited in time. Now, also taking place among jazz artists in the 1920s and the 1930s was the first war on drugs. And I feel like I should include this topic here because as we get more into contemporary history, the war on drugs and the really bad consequences of that for African American communities and young men and just like the country in general, you know, it has its antecedent in this first war on drugs. Drugs and alcohol use were popular among blues musicians and those who went to blues clubs, and the same can be said of early jazz musicians. And it was really easy to get drugs before 1906 because cannabis, cocaine, opium, all sold openly, all available as painkillers prescribed by doctors. The first U.S. drug control legislation didn't happen until 1906, and all that the Pure Food and Drug Act of that year required was that narcotics ingredients be listed on the labels of patent medicines that were being sold across state lines. Marijuana use, though, was considered to be bad by people who were middle class, who were white. They like to identify marijuana use with marginalized groups like artists, jazz musicians, bohemians, petty criminals, Mexican Americans, and African Americans. So you begin to get this sort of backlash against the use of drugs. California was the first state to ban the sale of Indian hemp, or loco weed as it was called, in 1913. And El Paso also passed an ordinance against it in 1915. El Paso Sheriff Stanley Good claimed that most Mexicans were addicted to marijuana, but an article that I read that was actually very interesting said that American fear of the drug had kind of been imported from Mexico, where the press in Mexico also thought that people who smoked marijuana were extremely violent and committed murders and all kinds of atrocities. The guy who is kind of single-handedly conducting the first war on drugs was Harry Anslinger. He had been involved with enforcing the nation's prohibition on alcohol. And then when the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was formed in 1930, he was tapped to head that new organization. He really emphasized the association between marijuana and politically marginal groups. He stirred up all kinds of fear about drugs' effects. And ultimately, he was able to forge a kind of latent social consensus against marijuana use among white people and middle-class people. Some of the ways that he did this, and he was in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics for 32 years, as you can see from my slide here. He ginned up all kinds of fear of drugs through a very hilarious movie called Reefer Madness, really a full-length propaganda film. He spoke before church groups, at women's clubs, in congressional hearings, and finally was able to get all 48 states at that time to pass a Uniform State Narcotics Act that made marijuana only available by prescription. And then many states said, okay, we want a federal law. And what followed was the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. This outlawed any recreational, non-medicinal, untaxed use or sale of marijuana. And the tax that was put on it was so prohibitive that it was really impossible for people to buy it even with a prescription. And I should say that, some doctors were not too happy about this because they did feel like marijuana had medical uses even at that time. Now, in addition to everything else, Harry Anslinger was an unrepentant racist who thought that African Americans, especially jazz musicians, were depraved. And he thought that they came on to white women and that they used marijuana to do this. His internal memos showed that he longed to have all the jazz musicians thrown in prison. He tried to crack down on the jazz world, but the musicians would not. They would not snitch on any of their numbers. They wouldn't rat anybody else out. But he did succeed in persecuting and hounding to her death the jazz singer Billie Holiday, who was addicted to heroin. Because Anslinger spent 3 decades as the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, this kind of ensured the nation would conduct a nonstop war on drugs under the belief that drug use and criminality were interlinked. People often look back and say, okay, well, Nixon started the war on drugs, but remember that Anslinger only stepped down in 1962. That distance between 1962 and 1973, not very long. So Nixon's war on drugs, just a continuation of the first war on drugs chronicled here. Okay, see you in the comments.